All right, well, hello everyone. Here we are for our third lesson, and this one will cover chapter 3 of your text, Freedom, Law, and Rights. And the title of that chapter is The Nature and Purpose of Government, a Lockean View. Up till now, we have been exploring some of the central concepts of American political order: freedom, law, rights. But we haven't discussed one concept that I'm sure most of you associate with the concept of freedom, and that is the concept of government. Probably when you signed up for this class, you had some general sense that we might be talking about government in this course. Well, we will to some degree, but your association is correct. In the American tradition, freedom and government are inseparably linked. And what exactly is that connection? That's what this chapter will explores and discusses. And the best place to see the connection between freedom, law, rights, and government is in the thought of a very famous political philosopher who was central to the development of the American tradition. And that is the English philosopher John Locke, who lived in the 17th century before the American Revolution, during the constitutional crisis that unfolded in 17th century England. Now, I don't know how much you know about English history, but just to give you a brief summary of the issues, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation in 1517, there emerged all over Europe, including England, what historians nowadays call the Age of Absolutism, that is 17th century England. The chief issue of the day, certainly for Locke, was to answer a question that is a perennial question in human experience. It's a question that had to be answered at the beginning of time, and it will have to be answered at the end of time, and it's one that we have to answer. And the question is this: what kind of obligation do we have to obey government? Now, there are two possibilities. Theorists said there are two potential types of obligation that we can hold. We can have what's called an absolute obligation, or we can have what's called a conditional obligation. For Christians, it's pretty easy to understand the difference between the two. Think of the Ten Commandments. As Christians, we have an obligation to obey the Ten Commandments. We all understand that. But what kind of obligation is it? Is it an absolute obligation or an unconditional obligation? An absolute obligation is one that is binding under any and all circumstances. If you have an absolute obligation, you are obliged to obey no matter what is happening, no matter what time you live in, what history, what culture, what your circumstances are. It doesn't matter. It's an absolute obligation that is unconditionally binding in any and all conceivable circumstances. Or an obligation can be conditional. And if an obligation is conditional, then the answer to the question is, when do we have to obey? If it's a conditional obligation, the answer is, well, it depends. It depends on whether there exist or not certain circumstances or conditions. So with respect to the Ten Commandments, I think it's clear that the obligation of Christians to obey the Ten Commandments is an absolute one. We're required to honor those moral rules under any and all circumstances. But now take this whole issue of the kind of obligation we have, absolute or conditional, and transpose that onto the question of government. What kind of obligation do we have as Americans or as members of any society to obey the existing government? Is it absolute or is it conditional? Again, an absolute obligation is one in which we are obliged to obey under any and all circumstances. Conditional is one in which we are obliged to obey when certain circumstances prevail. I routinely ask this question in my on-ground classes, and I ask students, well, what kind of obligation do we have as Americans to obey government, absolute or conditional? And I can say, in 20 years of teaching, uniformly to a person, I've never heard one person yet say, and one American person say, we have an absolute obligation. Americans believe they do have an obligation to obey government, but they regard it as a conditional obligation. It depends on one set of circumstances or another. And in fact, as we'll see, the American Revolution was fought on this very ground. The English government of the day was insisting that the Americans absolutely obey their laws, and the Americans said no. We don't have an absolute obligation to obey you. Our obligation is conditional, and you have not sustained the conditions that would make us obliged to obey you. And so therefore we have the right to resist and to revolt. Now the Americans, we'll get back to this, but the Americans didn't make up that theory. By their time, they inherited it from England, and England inherited from previous developments during the Middle Ages in Europe and so forth. It's based upon what's called a social contract theory of government. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard the term social contract, but what does that mean? A social contract, modern social contract theory attempts to answer the question regarding the origins of government. Where did government come from? All the social contract theorists believe that government originates by virtue of a voluntary contract or compact or agreement among the people. We agree to establish government. That's what social contract means, and there are conditions and terms involved in that agreement, which we shall get into. But social contract theory is an answer to the question of the origin of government, claiming that government originates in a voluntary agreement among the people. That was opposed to another common view that was held in 17th century England, where the kings, in the age of absolutism, began to claim to revive an old doctrine called the divine right of kings. And they were asserting that they were chosen by God to rule, and therefore to disobey them was to disobey God's will, and therefore the people, the subjects of the king, were absolutely obliged to obey him in any and all circumstances. And this was the very issue that would lead to the constitutional crisis in England in the 17th century, to the English Civil War, and to its ultimate resolution in what's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And the English philosopher John Locke was very, very active in all of these developments. And he is attempting, we talked about we mentioned social contract theory. There are three chief social contract theorists in the modern period. First is Thomas Hobbes, who was a generation older than Locke, also an English philosopher, political philosopher. Then we have John Locke. And then in the following century, in the 18th century, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French thinker who wrote a book also called On the Social Contract. Our concern is mainly with the Lockean version, because it was Locke's version that would deeply influence the thought and beliefs of the American colonists and provided them with the moral justification for their claim of the right to declare independence from England. So these social contract theorists, they all have in common the fact that they believe government originates in a voluntary agreement among the people. They also employ the same methodology and use the same symbolism in their attempt to answer this all-important question: what kind of obligation we have to government. The methodology they use is as follows, and I'll be rehearsing this going through Locke's version. They use similar terms such as state of nature, law of nature, natural rights, social contract, and others. They ask us, in the methodology they use in trying to answer this question of where did government come from and what is our obligation to obey government, they all use the same methodology. They ask us, and I'm going to ask you, to sort of engage in a hypothetical mental experiment as follows. Try to imagine a time of human society before formal institutions of government were instituted. That is, a pre-political state of human society. There's a society, there's us, there's all of us, but there are no formal governmental institutions. There are no kings or monarchs or presidents or parliaments or courts of law or prisons or nuclear bombs or any of those things. There's just us. It's just people. That state is so famous in Western political thought that it has a name. That state of society prior to the formal establishment of government is known as the state of nature. The state of nature. Use that term carefully, because in political thought it refers precisely to this condition I'm describing, human society prior to the establishment of government. It's a very ancient term. The ancient Greeks talked about a state of nature, the Romans, the Christians, and different historical periods interpreted it slightly differently. For example, the Christian tradition sometimes thought of the state of nature as the Garden of Eden or something to that effect. But by Locke's time, it was a well-known symbol that everybody understood what it meant. So they ask us, try to imagine what society looks like with no government. Now, what's it mean to say there's no government? As we'll see, if you strip away all the trappings and all the rhetoric, what is government? Government, at the end of the day, is the threat of human punishment in time, all right? Government is the guy with the club. They have the right to use coercive force, as we've seen. When they institute laws to protect us, they necessarily use coercion. Government is, they have the jails and the prisons and the courts and the whole system of justice and so forth. And so they are the threat of human punishment in time. So what happens if we take away government and there's just human society and there is no threat of human punishment in time? What does society look like? That's the question. The great difference between Hobbes and Locke is right here. Thomas Hobbes wrote a very famous book called Leviathan, published in 1651 at the height of the English Civil War. And he comes down on the side of the monarchs. He's going to argue that we do, in fact, have an absolute obligation to obey government. Now, how so? How does he reach that conclusion? Well, he describes what he thinks the state of nature looks like if you take away government. For Hobbes, if you take away government, you also take away all law, all morality, all justice, and you create instead what he calls a war of all against all, where it's the strong doing what they can and the weak suffering what they must. Might makes right. There's no justice, there's no morality, there's just predatory behavior by the physically and mentally stronger over those who are relatively weaker. Under such circumstances, he says, there is no possibility of civilization. We couldn't sit here having a nice conversation if we were worried every moment for our sheer survival and our self-preservation, always at the mercy of those of predators and those who would violate others. He says, so thus in the state of nature, he says, life is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. We don't want to live like that. So what do we do as members of this society? Hobbes says the only solution is that we have to agree to create a government. He calls it the sovereign. We agree among each other to create a sovereign, a government. And what are the terms of that? What else do we agree to? He says we agree to give up all of our rights. Because if you continue to claim a right against the government does something and you say, no, I have a right, and the other person says, no, I have a right, the other one says, I have a right, and the whole system collapses. So we agree to give up all of our rights, to alienate them all and transfer and give them to the sovereign. And we authorize him, Hobbes says, to do whatever is necessary to maintain peace and order. That's his job. And that's the terms of the contract. We give up our rights and we authorize the sovereign to do whatever is necessary to maintain peace and order. Only in such a fashion, Hobbes says, can civilization develop, where we can have art and commerce and education and all the other cultural values and experiences that make life worth living. So Hobbes comes down, so he says, well, we do then in fact have an absolute, once we create that sovereign, we have an absolute obligation to obey. No criticism, no resistance is permitted. That's the only way we can maintain peace and order. That's Hobbes's view. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to explain, there's pros and cons in Hobbes's view. We can't blink it away like it's never going to happen, because in fact, some people do act the way that Hobbes expects them to when in the absence of government. Some people who are internally lawless will engage in predatory and violent behavior against others. But Hobbes generalizes excessively, many scholars have argued, and he asserts that all people at all times will act that way. Locke and the Americans will disagree. That is not what the state of nature looks like. So Locke is going to come along in the next generation and take the opposite view to Hobbes. Locke instead is going to argue that we do have an obligation to obey government, but that obligation is conditional. And here's how he reaches his conclusion. He starts off just like Hobbes does. He says, okay, try to imagine a state of human society before the establishment of formal government, the state of nature, and what's that look like? Now, Hobbes was an atheist. Everybody knew that, although he couldn't say so out loud. It was illegal. But Locke was a pretty serious Christian, coming out of the Puritan tradition. He had a pretty conventional view of human nature and the origin of man, a biblical worldview. And so Locke says, no, here's the state of nature. What's it look like? Well, we're all, it's a pre-existing spiritual community. We're all children of God, put on this earth to fulfill his purpose, not the purpose of any other human being. We are created in God's image. Each person, every single one, there's a radical equality. God made us all spiritually equal, of equal worth. And he also endowed every single person with reason, with free will, and with a great spiritual purpose to fulfill on this earth. He says we are God's property, put on this earth to go about his business and not follow the will of another human being. So there's no natural hierarchy. There's no divine right of kings. God didn't assign one group special privilege to rule over others or anything like that. There's just us. We're radically equal. We're free. We are rational. And most important of all, remember, Hobbes said that when you take away government, you also take away law and morality. Locke rejects that. He says, no, and I'm quoting here, he says, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. And reason tells us what that law is. Now let me stop and explain these terms. State of nature, we know, the pre-political state of society. But what's the meaning of this very famous term, the law of nature? The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. Well, it should be familiar to you if you're familiar with American founding documents, because Thomas Jefferson uses the same exact phrase in the Declaration of Independence. But it goes back even further. The law of nature is a persistent ideal held throughout the development of Western civilization. The Greeks used the term the law of nature. The Romans, most famously Cicero, but many others, elaborated the meaning of the law of nature. The Christians took over the term and reinterpreted it as meaning God's moral law and so forth. The law of nature, even though it has slightly different meanings in different historical contexts, always refers to the same general concept. And that is the law of nature is a moral law that is given to human beings, that we don't create. It doesn't matter whether we like it or not. We don't vote it into existence. Whether we agree with it or not, it doesn't matter, because it is a moral law given to us as human beings. And our task is to align our actions with this given moral law, whose ultimate author is God. Christians understand this, certainly the Ten Commandments and the parts of Scripture that speak of law. In fact, the early Christians often thought of the law of nature as what Romans calls the unwritten laws in our heart. That there is a moral order in existence that is superior to human preference. We don't make it up. And it's there whether we agree with it or not. It doesn't matter. It's given to us by God. So Locke asserts that he says the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. There is a moral order in the state of nature. There are given rules of right and wrong that, moreover, every single person is able to recognize and know. Now, how do we know the law of nature? How do we know the moral law? He says the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason tells us what that law is. Every human being possesses reason. Again, from the ancient Greeks all the way up through Locke and beyond. The idea was, what's the defining attribute of man? What makes human beings different from every other kind of created entity? It's the fact that man has reason. We are rational. So we have reason, and it's our reason that allows us to know the moral law. And then Locke goes further and tells us what that moral law is. I'll repeat the full sentence. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason tells us that we are not to harm one another in our life, liberty, health, or property. We all know that. You don't have to have 20 years of theological training or participation in a church. Every human being who's ever lived knows deep down inside that they are not to violate other human beings in their life, liberty, health, or property. Everybody knows it. How do we know? We don't have to be moral geniuses. All we have to know is that as individuals, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that every single one of you will agree with this, that I know, for example, that I myself do not want to be harmed in my life, liberty, health, or property. I know that for a fact, and no one can convince me otherwise. So I know I don't want it. So all I have to do to recognize and honor the moral law is to look at another person and make the recognition, that's a human being, just like me. So I therefore know that he or she also does not want to be harmed in his life, liberty, health, or property. I don't have to be a genius to figure that out. I know I don't want it. I know you're a human being just like me. I know you don't want it either. So Locke tells us every one of us recognizes that that is the moral truth. That's the moral law. We are not to harm one another in our life, liberty, health, or property. Now let's stop right here. Another very famous concept that comes in the Lockean and American tradition, we've already discussed this, is the concept of natural rights. As we've seen in chapters 1 and 2, in our tradition, we believe we have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Well, where do they come from? Right here. They come from the law of nature, the moral law that is given to man. The moral law says we are not to harm each other in their life, liberty, health, or property. That means you are entitled to your life, liberty, and property. You have a natural right to them. And you have a natural right to them because the moral law tells me that I am forbidden to violate your right, your life, liberty, and property, which means you have a right to life, liberty, and property. So our natural rights follow from the moral law that is given to man. And this is the firmest, as we've seen, the firmest possible foundation one can have for a right. We don't make it up. Human beings don't invent it. We don't vote on it. It's not the gift of government or society. It comes to us directly by God, who made us the kind of creature who is inherently entitled to be treated a certain way, that is, not to be violated in their life, liberty, health, or property. Okay, so that's the very basic framework that Locke says. So what's the state of nature look like? I often think, and I sometimes say to my students in the classroom, Locke's state of nature is actually not really all that bad of a place to be. It kind of looks to me like a typical classroom here at PBA. We all know that we're a pre-existing spiritual community, put on earth by God, made in his image, with reason, with free will. We know there's a moral order, that we are not to harm others in their life, liberty, health, or property. Most of us believe we have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. So it's sort of like a classroom here at PBA. And so the question is, now see, in Hobbes's case, it's easy to see why Hobbes would argue that we need to leave the state of nature, form a government, and go live under what's called civil or political society. But in Locke's case, it's not so obvious. Why would we leave the state of nature? It's not that bad. We have reason, we have free will, there's a moral order that we all know, we have natural rights. Why don't we just stay there? Why would we decide voluntarily to agree to create a government and leave the state of nature and go live under civil or political society? Well, in our next session, I'm going to close this for now, but in our next session, I'm going to explain to you Locke's reasoning about why we would decide to create a government. And I won't give it away. I'll leave it to you to sit on the edge of your seat and wait for our next session. See you soon. Bye.